she calls it like she sees it. And if she thinks you're clean, she's going to write it. So when they read, oh, Dr. Veronica Thomas, oh, okay. Well, if she says you're clean, you can take that to the bank, because she don't say you're clean unless you're clean. Whereas other doctors, it doesn't give the same weight. They don't do the same tests. And there are a battery of tests, standardized psychological tests that are accepted in the psychiatric community as reliable to determine future conduct. No one can predict what people can do in the future, but the best they can do are these tests. MMPI, Rorschach, there's a lot of different things, and I'm sure this weekend there are other doctors talking about that. Even the penile plethysmograph that I believe Dr. Raymond Anderson uses. Never saw it, don't think I want to, but it's pretty funky. But these are the things to put together in a certificate of rehabilitation. It's filed in the county where you live. Now, if you look at 290.5, 290.5 basically says a certificate of rehabilitation will stop your obligation from registering in all instances except these. And it's a pretty extensive list, unfortunately. That list is pretty extensive. But there are crimes, sex crimes, that aren't on that list. The 314s, the 647.6s, even now the oral copulation. If you look at 290.5N, it says 288A B1, oral copulation, 16, 17-year-old, as long as it's not a felony. Well, now the law says forget it. That becomes discretionary, so that's been outdated, and now that's not the law. But the 290.5 gives you a list of all the sex crimes that a certificate won't stop registration. Some say, for example, a sexual battery. A certificate will not stop registration on a sexual battery to get merely a certificate unless a sexual battery is a misdemeanor. So what do? You pled to a felony, and you didn't go to prison 10 years ago. Then what are you looking for? 17B, California Penal Code Section 17B, you can reduce a felony down to a misdemeanor. And if it's reduced to a misdemeanor, 17B says it's a misdemeanor for all purposes. I got my misdemeanor, I got my certificate, no longer registration. So when clients come in my office and they say, well, you know, I got a felony, 243.4 sexual battery, we'll get the certificate. That won't stop your obligation from registering. So what do? Turn it around and try to get a 17B motion granted. If it's granted and it's reduced to a misdemeanor, it's a misdemeanor. Then you get the certificate, and the certificate you'll no longer have to register. But I never put in any certificate of rehabilitation. I never put in my motion that we want to get the certificate granted so my client doesn't have to register. I don't want the judge to think about that. And most judges don't know about certificates and pardons. It isn't really what they do. Judges do criminal law. And the criminal panel, they do trials. They do preliminary hearings. They do pretrials. They do criminal law. This post-conviction certificate pardons, they're not familiar with. Most aren't at all. I don't want to familiarize with them. Just give me the certificate because I earned it. I behaved. I went to counseling, completed it. They forgive me, I forgive. Everything works now in my life. And doctor, good psych eval, all that good stuff. He shouldn't have to, he earned the right to get a certificate of rehabilitation. I don't say that, because if it's granted, you don't have to register. Oh, maybe the judge might be more leery and not want to sign it. The judge can deny it. They can exercise discretion and say, I don't believe you've been rehabilitated yet. I don't believe it's been enough time. I know 10 years is the minimum, but I want a little more time. They can deny it without prejudice, meaning you can renew it down the road. So you never want to bring that up. I don't want to bring it up. I don't want the judge to make that determination. Oh, so if I sign this, he doesn't have to register? I don't want to call that shot. I know there's a doctor's report. I know all that, but judges don't like to make those type of decisions, so I don't bring that up. And I just simply let it go. Most courts, I know in Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and LA, there's no formal evidentiary hearing. You file it, you give a copy to the DA, you go to court, you're standing next to your client, it's granted or it's denied. Rarely is there any formal testimony taken. The doctor has a full report. Everything you want is in that report. The DA gets a copy, and they can look at it if they want to determine whether the person qualifies or not. Most DAs won't. If this guy's a perfect model citizen, either they'll say there's not enough time, or they'll just submit. But most DAs won't say, Your Honor, I'm with the defense on this. I think this man earned a right to have it granted. Please grant it. And most DAs don't do that. Even if in their heart they feel it. They'll tell me, take me aside, Steve, between you and me. I give it to this guy. Look, he's a great guy, but my boss, they dance on strings. And that's just how it is when you're in the government work. You dance on strings, and if you want to keep that string in work and employment, You better do what your boss tells you to do. These are marching orders. So a lot of times when you're looking across the table at the DA, it's just marching orders, not necessarily what the DA personally in their heart thinks. But a certificate, like I said, is filed in the county where you live. In the crimes where it doesn't stop registration, 288 doesn't stop registration, let's say, a certificate, if granted, acts as a direct pardon to the governor. So if the judge says, I grant the certificate of rehabilitation, that certificate gets stapled together, the clerk ships it off to the governor. It's basically the Superior Court judge asking the governor, pardon this guy. I gave him a certificate, I'm requesting you to pardon him. Now there's two ways to get to the governor's office. One is by way of a certificate, and one is a certificate of rehabilitation. If granted, goes to the governor. What if you don't qualify for a certificate? You haven't lived here in 5 years, you live out of state, but the conviction was in California. You don't qualify for a certificate, you don't live here. Then the only thing left is a direct pardon. Not easy, but that's what's available to you. So it's better going to the governor's office by way of a certificate, because you basically have a Superior Court judge blessing you. You're in, as opposed to a direct pardon. Now, if you look at all the pardons, some were direct, a lot of them were by way of certificate of rehabilitation. Now, of course, there weren't sex crimes, as you can see, but most were by way of a certificate, because you already have a Superior Court judge blessing you, and it's preferred going that way if you possibly can, if you qualify. If you live out of state, then of course you don't. You're stuck with going the traditional pardon route. Any questions so far about certificates of rehabilitation? Anything at all about how it works?
I have a question.
Sure.
Which is about, in your experience, about the differences in counties. So, something like Orange County versus LA.
Well, LA's great, and you can tell why LA would be great. It's a liberal city, and who do they? It's a liberal city, right? And who do they elect? Liberal judges. And so it's pretty much, you'll find some hanging judges everywhere, of course, but LA I found very liberal. They grant pretty much most, if you qualify, there's no violations. There's no compelling reason why I shouldn't grant it. So usually certificates are granted. Most of mine are if we have all our ducks in line. Now, you can get a certificate of rehabilitation even on a forcible rape case, and you've been to prison. You can do that. And sometimes the judge may deny it. The crime was serious. And it's only been 10 years. They say, look, counsel, he's doing great. Sir, you're doing fabulous. I want a little more time under my belt. I know the 10's the minimum, counsel. I need a little longer. Orange isn't bad either. You get DAs in Orange County more who may want to scream and yell a little bit about it. In my experience, again, it's getting more conservative. Riverside, San Bernadino, they grant them usually, in my experience. San Diego has a different system. You can file it, but they don't even like dealing with the court. You get a DA clerk. The DA clerks deal with it, not even real DAs. Law students deal with it, and they do a background check on you, and if it comes back favorable, they'll recommend to the judge too. So there's no hearing, it's done. You already got it granted. So San Diego is actually pretty smooth with that, but LA I find pretty good. Counties that are perhaps more difficult might be considered Ventura County, a little more conservative. The joke about Ventura, come on vacation, leave on probation. Ventura's can be pretty tough in my experience, but clearly it's doable. And the longer you wait past the 10 years, greater chance of it granted, because you have all those years of good conduct. Okay, now, any other questions about certificates? Yes?
You get the certificate and then it goes to the governor and he issues a pardon. At that point, are you relieved of the registration requirement?
Okay, if the governor ever decides to grant a pardon on a sex crime, that will stop your obligation from registering.
Yes.
It's a big if, but Jerry Brown, look, if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be him. It's not if, it's when. Come on. Arnold granted 7. He's already granted in his last tenure and this tenure over 400 or 500 pardons. Over 200 right now since he's been governor so far, and Arnold granted 7, and the others, they don't grant him much. So if the governor does grant a pardon, that act in of itself will stop obligation from registering in every instance. Now, the caveat on that is the new laws, and we'll talk about that. So remind me to talk about, well, I will talk about it. Sometime this we'll talk about it. There's ways, sometimes in the future, a governor may not be able to help you stop registering because the laws may change on that.
Getting off registration, when that happens, does that take you out of the system? And what I'm asking is that I went to Mexico 3 weeks ago on vacation. Came back, showed my passport, and I had to go to another line to do a second check. It was no big deal, but you know, I still had to go be identified.
Right.
And so, and the officer said, get used to this. He said, as long as you're on the system, you're gonna be
Well,
flagged.
if you are okay, this might be the conversation you're having next door. I think there's someone doing that, talking about that. Oh, my clients tell me it is brutal traveling. You're a 290 registrant. I've been registering for 20 years. Not on probation, on parole, I'm done, finished. No violations of law for 20 years. If you're a 290 registrant, they can remove you from the line. You'll talk to somebody else. What are you doing? Where are you going? Especially if you're coming from those certain countries, Philippines, Southeast Asia, where they know it's notorious for sex slaves, and this is what they have in their head. So they'll pull you aside. They may thumb through your stuff. They may ask you questions, but they can't detain you. You're going to move out of there. You'll be out of there, but here, with your group of friends. Hey, Joe, where you going? And you never told them, let's say. Yeah, nothing. I'm just terribly humiliating, and I don't know the answers. Maybe that gentleman talking about it in the other room might know about travel, but if you're no longer a 290 registrant, I don't know. I mean, if you're no longer a registrant, you're not on the list, then I don't know if they pull you aside. If you win and you're no longer 290 registrant, I don't know why they pull you aside.